Okay, so we're on to the second session, which is social tensions and conflicts, past and present context, and I'm going to let Judge Nicholson do his thing here as the chair.
Thank you. I'd just like to welcome you then and to introduce the first speaker. That's Dr. Julian Brown. You'll be talking about citizenship in the context of insurgency. Now, Julian Brown is a very distinguished academic, and he's a senior lecturer in the Department of Political Studies at the University of Witwatersrand. He has a Doctor of Philosophy in Modern History from the University of Oxford and is the author of South Africa's Insurgent Citizens on Dissent and the Possibility of Politics, that was published in 2015, and The Road to Soweto, Resistance and the Uprising of the 16th of June 1976, and that was published this year. So it is with great pleasure that I give you Dr. Julian Brown.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me properly through the microphone? Great. I am deeply honored to be here at this inaugural colloquium and to have the opportunity to talk about some of my ideas in discourse and engagement and conversation with some of the ideas of Mzala and some of the ideas of my many esteemed colleagues here today. I am not going to say much about other people's work. I am going to hope that by setting out a few questions and a few ideas, we can spark a conversation about one of two of the key themes that this colloquium has been organized around. And I think it's appropriate to start by drawing attention to the question that's written at the top of the conference program as the organizing theme for today and tomorrow's discussions. To what extent has the country achieved the goals of the liberation struggle? I want us to start with this question because it isn't questioning in uncertainty and in doubt that scholarship begins. We do not start with all of the answers. We start with problems. And one of the great insights of the work we derive from Marx and from others, of course, is the idea that we begin with problems. Problems of politics, problems of society, and of course, problems of economics. How do they relate to each other? Under what conditions do they determine each other? And how do we respond? Or to phrase another more famous Marxist, what is to be done? It is in questioning, though, that we learn not to rely on our certainties and not to assume the answers or the solutions to any given problems. In setting up a question to begin this discussion, to what extent has a country achieved the goals of the liberation struggle, we set up a range of problems to address. Part of that problem is identifying what the goals of the liberation struggle were in the first place. And the other part of it is to try to understand whether or not, or in what ways, our contemporary society might measure up to those goals. Now, let me start by saying it's impossible to imagine that the liberation struggle ever had one single goal. I want to focus, however, on one of the most prominent aspects of the liberation struggle. One of those aspects that was able to bind together people of very different political backgrounds and with very different political ideas of what might come afterwards. The idea of citizenship. The idea that one of the goals of the liberation struggles was to make it possible for every person in South Africa to claim a political role, to have political agency, and to act above board within a legal system, a social system, and a political system that permitted, encouraged, and enabled that action. Now, if I could give a crudely orthodox Marxist vision, I would say that would be impossible without socio-economic transformation. But we have had some form of liberation on that line. We have a situation 20 or so years after the end of apartheid in which formal democratic citizenship has been extended well beyond the boundaries that it had before. People of all races, however one defines race, people of all colors, however one defines color, have the ability to formally participate in the electoral system. And I think it's important to start there because I don't want to diminish that achievement. It is a significant achievement. But it is also clearly, and we wouldn't be asking these questions, and we wouldn't be having these colloquia, an insufficient victory. It does not take us far enough. It does not bring us, perhaps not into a rainbow society, but into the sunlit uplands of a new society. Formal democracy is important, but it is not the end of any political struggle. Has South Africa achieved the goals of liberation? Well, a potential starting point is to say, in part. Where do we go from now? Well, there are many different answers. I want to focus, again, still on citizenship. What does formal citizenship mean? What does it entail? What does it not succeed in delivering? I'm going to refer to the book that I'm going to be partially launching this evening at the great generosity of the Mzala Center to have the opportunity to talk to and show you the book. The reason I'm going to do this is it allows me to do a lot of shortcuts and to not attempt to try and articulate every part of the ideas that I want to say. In this book, what I take up as a problem is the persistence of popular protest in South Africa 20 years after the granting of formal citizenship rights. Is this a sign of a failure of democracy? Is this a sign that formal citizenship is not working? Is it a sign of exclusion? Or is it a sign of something else entirely? Now, we are probably all familiar with the figures and the numbers and the prevalence of protest. But it is worth emphasizing once again the scale of popular protest in South Africa today. There are hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands of protests taking place across the country on an annual basis. When the police count protests, and they count them in problematic ways, so I don't want to give too precise numbers, but when the police count protests, they count tens of thousands a year, out of which thousands are regarded as violent protests. Protests in which some form of confrontation between the police and protesters has taken place. About half a dozen years ago, Peter Alexander coined a phrase to describe this. He called South Africa the world capital of protest. Now, this is probably a bit of an exaggeration. South Africa is hardly unique in the scale of popular protest. But it is striking. And it's striking because we have adopted a myth of democracy. A myth that says that popular franchise, universal access to the vote, and a set of limited political rights is freedom, is autonomy, is liberation. If that's true, then the fact that tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of South Africans take to the streets and protest is a problem. The ways in which people protest are manifold and take many different forms. Some of these protests, the most common of them, have been characterized as service delivery protests. In other words, protests of the very poor, protests caused by the unequal distribution of resources within society. There is an obvious truth to this description. Many, many protests of the poor, many of those protests that take place in informal settlements on the edges of townships, and amongst people who have very little access to formal wealth, are of course caused by poor service delivery, of course triggered by the inability to gain a house, the inability to have water, the restriction on the use of electricity, and so on and so forth. These are the immediate pressing concerns of everyday life. But to only think about these protests as protests triggered by their specific causes is, I want to suggest, also deeply limiting. It does not permit us to understand how so many diverse protests, which might be dismissed under the term popcorn protests, can persist, can continue, and can possibly form a counter-politics within contemporary South Africa. And what I suggest in my book, in which I am not going to bore you with the detailed theoretical arguments, you can read it, it's available for a very cheap price. Capitalism continues to dominate just outside this room, is that in the process of protest, in the process of taking to the streets, and of articulating claims that highlight the inequality of society, large communities in South Africa are constituting themselves as political agents. And the word I want to use to talk about political agents, the common everyday word we use, is citizens. Those who are able to act politically. But the kind of citizenship that they are asserting is not a citizenship of voting. It is not a citizenship always and inevitably of standing for office, or launching political parties, or supporting one or another existing structure. It is a citizenship of citizenship of insurgency, of acting spontaneously, with all of the scare quotes that should come with the word spontaneously, of acting outside of clear ideological traditions and trajectories, and acting primarily on the basis that they themselves are actors, that they themselves can act, and that they themselves are the best people to interpret and understand the everyday context of their lives. In other words, although the state offers participatory institutions of governance, although the state offers services, and although the state does attempt to engage regularly with many of these communities, that engagement is regularly rejected. It is rejected on the basis that knowledge brought from outside, technical expertise, and a set of answers developed in and amongst often people like ourselves, academics, experts, economists, etc., are insufficient to understand or comprehend or respond to the everyday circumstances of social and economic life for the poor. And that a solution brought to the table, rather than a solution developed between equals, is no solution. Again in the book, what I try to do with this idea is to explore the different ways within which political agency, political ideas, and political practices develop in the course of protests, in the aftermath of protests, in engagements between protesting communities and the state, during attempts by some protesting communities and NGOs to engage with each other, and of course in the courts themselves. All of these are different spheres and areas within which this insurgent form of citizenship can be played out. I do suggest that it's ambiguous, that there isn't an automatic, necessarily redistributive politics at this core, nor is it necessarily and automatically a progressive politics. Sometimes the politics of the poor is autocratic, sometimes it is illiberal, xenophobic, and so on and so forth. But it can also be deeply emancipatory. And I do think that even in its less progressive forms, the claim to knowledge, the claim to agency, and the claim to the ability to engage as equals is the core of an emancipatory politics. And it's a politics that cannot be delivered from above. It's a politics that can only develop from below. And it's this point that I just want to speak very briefly on in this context. One of the dangers of a tool as powerful as the state, and as powerful ideologically as Marxism, or even the left understood more broadly, is that it can fool us into imagining we have the answers. And not only the answers, through the state, the ability to implement them. We might be right. We might have the answers to any particular problem, to any particular everyday crisis. But if we seek to impose those answers from above, we run the risk of what the South African state, even in all of its redistributive efforts, has come to face 20 years after the end of apartheid. Rule without hegemony, rule without the support of the people that the rule is for. I don't need to underline all of the various standard critiques of political society in post-apartheid South Africa, the declining share of the vote, the difficulties of organizing outside of established and accepted networks, the rise of movements that position themselves to the left of the ANC in some ways and not in others. All I want to suggest is that any politics in post-apartheid South Africa that does not start from an acceptance of the equal ability of the poor to understand their own lives, to articulate their own claims, and to assert their own agency in their own terms, risks disconnecting. It risks being unable to respond. And not only being unable to respond, it risks no longer being able to engage at all. It is only an engagement between equals that a democratic emancipatory politics can be located. And so long as we start from the answers and not the questions, as long as we start from prescriptions rather than engagement, understand, and attempts to understand, attempts to transcend any particular model, to appropriate, to instead engage with and extract knowledge, ideas from those that we are seeking to engage with, then we run the risk not of producing new knowledge, producing new politics and emancipating, but rather of creating and constituting new classes of excluded peoples. I'm going to stop.
Thank you very much, Julian. Our next speaker is Mr. Freddie Mongani, who is going to speak on the topic, back to where we started, what should we do with African customary law? Mr. Mongani is a non-practicing attorney. He holds a Bachelor of Sacred Theology from St. Joseph's Theological Institute in this province, an LLB and an LLM from the University of Witwatersrand. He's currently reading towards an LLD at the University of UNISA. He is a senior lecturer in the Department of Jurisprudence at that university. In the last 8 years, his research has focused on issues such as ethics, international human rights law, public international law, and philosophy. He has delivered conference papers both locally and internationally, and some of his research has been published in peer-reviewed journals. It is with great pleasure that I introduce then our next speaker.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. I am very humbled to be here this morning. I'm not a Marxist. I know very little about Marxism. But I'll use the man we are celebrating today as a platform for me to share some of my views, which I've been reflecting upon for the past 8 years or so. My topic is back to where we started. What should we do with African customary law? Perhaps let me just start by asking two questions. 22 years into the constitutional democracy, can you go to your employers and produce a letter from a Sangoma and say, for the past 2 weeks I was sick? Will they accept it? For the past 22 years, please remind me of any matter which was culturally sensitive, which went to any of our courts and succeeded. I'm not aware of any. But let me take you through what I think was the cause of the wheels coming off from the system. In 1960, Hallo and Khan boldly wrote in the textbook that was used at most universities. The title of the textbook was The Union of South Africa, the Development of its Laws and Constitution. That, and I quote, although South Africa forms part of the Black continent, by history and culture, it is an offshoot of Western Europe. End of quote. And I tried to ask myself, if I were to revise this publication so that I can make it relevant for today, would I change this sentence? That South Africa is part of an offshoot of Western Europe. I came to the conclusion that no, it is very relevant for today. Simply because when you look at other disciplines, they have made progress in trying to retell history from the point of view of those who have been marginalized. But in law, there hasn't been any progress. We are still an offshoot of Western Europe today. In law, there are different groups that are contesting for a certain space in the discourse. We have critical legal studies, we have feminist jurisprudence, we have Marxist jurisprudence, we have legal realists, and if you go to any universities, students have to study those. But African jurisprudence is one of the very faint and invisible footnotes which no one cares about. And yet that African philosophy is the core of the majority of the people that graduates in law are going to serve later. Now question, what must we then do with African customary law? Because it is the embodiment of who we are. This whole morning I was listening to presenters talking about walking left. My simple question is, walking left as who? By posing that question, I'm suggesting that perhaps we need to pause and reflect on who we are as people who are walking left. When we look at the history of the legal system in South Africa, we will realize that there has been a great deal of Western chauvinism, which regarded most of Western thinking as universal and unchanging. Those who are familiar with the legal system in South Africa will know that it is a concoction or a combination of three legal systems: Roman law, Roman Dutch law, English law. And historically, the three have been consistent in excluding African customary law. African customary law, especially the part that relates to private law, was only applicable if it was not repugnant to Western system. or Western way of thinking. And in that process, African customary law found itself divided into two systems. There was one system that developed within the courts, and there was one system that continued to be a lived reality of your general masses out there. Now today, if we pause and ask myself and say, what must we do with African customary law? My immediate question will be, which one? The one that is developed through the courts, or the one that people are living out there? And if you tell me about the one that people are living out there, it is not written anywhere in books. And if you tell me about the one that is developed through the courts, it is distorted. It doesn't capture who we are. And if you want to escape the two, welcome back to Roman law or Roman Dutch law. 1993 was a watershed moment for all of us here in South Africa. We were all weary and tired of what we experienced through the colonial period and through apartheid. The negotiators of the interim constitution saw the interim constitution as a bridge from the past of oppression to a new future, where whatever step that will be taken will be justified, and justified in law and property. And to appease the masses, the epilogue of the interim constitution included Ubuntu. And we know from Professor Ramos, who is also my colleague, that Ubuntu is the root of African philosophy. Its constitutive elements are to be found in religion, in philosophy, in culture, in ethics, and in law. So for your modern day average law student, already what I have mentioned is confusing, because law is very precise. It works on definitions, and those definitions must be very clear. Now, if you were to come to me and tell me that Ubuntu is law, is religion, is ethics, what is that? Legal. So this same question that I'm asking to say, what is this Ubuntu thing? My suspicion is that the drafters of the final constitution struggled with it, and they did not know how to conceptualize it. And the simple answer in dealing with this crisis was to leave it out. If you take your final constitution, which we have today, it doesn't have Ubuntu. Meaning that your average African person that you meet on the street, when they hold the final constitution, they will have to struggle to find themselves reflected in that constitution. If you want to see yourself reflected in that constitution, you must be reflected on borrowed terms, meaning on Western concepts of understanding who you are. Just like, as I asked earlier, if you want to be sick today as an employee, you better go to a doctor who will use stethoscope and give you a proper letter that the system will accept, not a letter from someone. My question, can I not be sick as an African and be sick in an African way? Judge Dennis Davis, reflecting on the omission of Ubuntu in the final constitution, says that probably it was excluded because we know that there were many South Africans who were involved in the drafting and negotiating of the constitution. But there were also drafters who were from Canada and other jurisdictions. So for them it did not make sense. They struggled with that, and they managed to make a case that it should be excluded. Two of our South African scholars have reflected on the Constitution and said, perhaps the Bill of Rights, that very chapter that we all boast about, should be seen as a new repugnancy clause in the post-1994 era. Because if you look at the Constitution, it tells you that African customary law is applicable when it is applicable. My question, when is it applicable? Is that when the parties are black? If I'm black and I marry a white person and I pay lobola, is African customary law applicable? If I die and choose not to draft a will, which is a common African thing, to surrender all my wishes to the collective, that the collective will take care of me even when I'm gone, can my estate be dissolved in a system that is properly African, without any intervention of any of interstate succession? Can it? So I have a very simple argument that no matter how much we love our new constitution, the fact remains that it is incompatible with the African system of thinking. It is incompatible, no matter how much we want to argue. And for me, in here lies the answer of all the cases that have gone through our courts and not succeeded. I'm Catholic by religion, and I would like to borrow an analogy from the Catholic Church to say, if you are a woman and you want to become a Catholic priest, no matter how well you present your case before the Pope, you already know your answer even before you leave here to go and ask to be ordained as a priest. Now, when you look at the system, the legal system, and the way it operates within the borrowed Western concept, we know that it will not have answers to African questions. And this is why it will not have answers. The Western system endorses the notion of the sovereign individual. And for the sovereign individual, the law is a tool which you use against everybody else. Whereas the African approach, we start from us. And the law is an instrument that we use to maintain harmony. So if you go to a system which is confrontational, and the argument or the issue at hand arose from the African context of the African system, don't you already know the answer? At least I do. Professor Van Niekerk says, and I would like to quote here, that judged by Western standards, many indigenous laws will be found to be unjust and should be abolished. By the same token, if judged within the framework of African jurisprudence, Western law may be found to be falling short of African jurisprudence. End of quote. Then my question still stands. What must we do with African customary law? Professor Van Niekerk again suggests that perhaps we need to add African customary law to the three layers: Roman law, Roman Dutch law, English law, and add African customary law. She calls it a layer of a cake. And my argument is we cannot add it there because the ingredients of the two cakes are not the same. It will not fit in. And if we add it, on which terms? On its own terms or on Western-based terms? The second one is that perhaps we need to create a slot for it, which already exists, the African customary law slot, and slot it in there. But I've already indicated that we have two legal systems that have emerged in history. We've got one that is developed through the courts and one that is lived reality out there. So which slot are you going to put it in? The third one is that perhaps we need to create a new paradigm altogether. And I support this one. That we need a new paradigm where African people will say, I am because we are, and since we are, therefore I am. And this is not from me, I'm borrowing it from somebody else. the philosophical foundation upon which the South African Constitution is founded is skewed in favor of the Western conception of reality. Very much so. And as I've indicated, the Western paradigm endorses the sovereign individual. But what I find interesting is that when there is a crisis, we struggle to appeal to the communal sense of understanding reality. You would have followed the judgment that was given in the Janus Walu's parole application. Because Ubuntu is no longer part of the court's language, the poor judge struggled to conceptualize why the Hani family must forgive. And she made a big mistake of her life, and she said, the Hani family must, quote unquote, move on. Now, perhaps if Ubuntu was still in the constitution and she had said, what we appeal for from the Hani family is that they must have Ubuntu, perhaps that would have made the cut. Now, in the post-1994 era, there are a number of challenges that we are faced with. We are complacent. Everybody is proud of the new constitution. We've just finished celebrating the fact that it's 20 years since it was what's the right word? 20 years since it was adopted in Sharpeville. We are very proud of that. But for your average African there, we are very proud to say for the past 20 years, we've been excluded from the system. The second danger is that if you question the new constitutional dispensation, the problem is not with the system, but with you. That is why at the beginning I said, I would like to hide behind the men we are celebrating today to say views like this, knowing that I'm protected. Now, in the very end, if I did not succeed in putting my point across, let me borrow from somebody who will perhaps put my point across in a better way. And I'd like to read it. The quote says, there are many beginnings beyond Adam and Eve. And there are many foundational languages beyond Greek and Latin. And there are many economic theories beyond Adam Smith and political theories beyond Machiavelli and Thomas Hobbes. End of quote. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Freddie and Julian. I'm going to open the floor for questions and take a number of rounds of questions. That seems to be the way to deal with it. But I'd just like to exercise the prerogative of the chair to put a question or two myself. And I'd just like to put a small context to this. Some Peter Blanche, I'm sure you all know his writings. But to echo what Professor Maro said this morning, he said there are 10 million South Africans without any access to any income whatsoever, no government grant, no job or anything. He said of the 25 million poorest South Africans, 24 million are Africans. And when people say to me, you know, why do you blame apartheid for everything? I just say to them, how many whites live in Umlazi? My second question is, how many white domestic servants have you seen in South Africa? And then for some strange reason, they keep silent. On a lighter note, you know, I was asked once what the difference is between a lawyer and a rhino. I thought they were very, very different. And the answer is, in theory, you can stop a rhino charging. So, you can't stop lawyers charging. And the reason I mention that is in the context of both our speakers. Lawyers require lots of money. There are very few who work for nothing. And I pride myself as spending 10 years in the Legal Resources Centre, helping people with problems of a public interest nature. But in the context of our two speakers, I was wondering if those people who indulge in protest have any of the financial means to protest effectively, have access to references to argue their cases, to means to approach authorities in a proper manner. And I'm thinking for Julian of a question along these lines. As I understood the Arab Spring, much of that was organized on social media. And I wonder if we have such a large proportion of our protests being protests by Africans. Do they have that access to the social media? Are they able to mobilize effectively? And is their vulnerability largely due to their poverty? And secondly, for Freddie, in the context of lawyers always wanting money, when I was part of Legal Resources Centre and we were advising 99% African people about their rights, those laws were very difficult to find. We had to spend 6 months or so updating the code of Natal Zulu law, or the code of Zulu law as it was known. You had to find 45 different amendments in order to find that law. But if you had a problem with income tax, you'd go to the library and you'd find a glossy book which would tell you exactly, what the laws are on income tax. So, as a great French writer said, the law is available for the rich and the poor in the same way as the Hotel Ritz is available. So, I believe that customary law suffers because a lot of the people who make use of it are poor people and they have no real access to justice. So that I believe that customary law will find its way forward when more people who work under it, who live under it, have access to funds. So, in a sense, poverty and the access to justice for those people subject or as part of a customary law system go hand in hand. So now I've finished my prerogative and now I'm looking around for hands. Becky, is there a roving mic?
Thanks, Chair. Mine is a very simple one. A few days ago, Winnie Madikizela Mandela's case was thrown out of court. And I just want to know from Freddie specifically as to whether this case was dismissed by virtue of it being of customary nature, or was it because of Winnie Madikizela Mandela's misinterpretation of both customary law and Western law?
Hi, my comment is actually for Freddie as well, but it's a comment, not a question. I wanted to suggest that your framework is perhaps not incompatible with a Marxist analysis. When you say that the Western system endorses the notion of the sovereign individual as espoused by Kant and Locke, I think that it's also important to note that Locke was one of the first prominent capitalist land grabbers, right? So perhaps this isn't just a matter of a cultural impression that was embedded into him, but it was also the fact that there were real motivations, there were economic motivations behind their political philosophy as well. Because, for example, dissolving one's estate into the collective is certainly not incompatible with Marxism. Right? So, just a suggestion there that the two might not be so.
I have a comment, Freddie. It's not really a question. I attended a conference in December in India, and it was organized by the Commission on Legal Pluralism, which is actually engaging with precisely the ideas that you and the questions that you are raising about cruel forms of legality. And there are some very interesting movements and organizations all over the world that organize people around agitating for their rights under customary law and then engage with mainstream sort of legal institutions. So that's just something I'm sharing with you. So I don't know if you know it, and there's been research as well from there. And I've got a second for Julian, sorry. My understanding from your commentary on organization is that you are arguing against the role of the intelligentsia. I might be wrong, so maybe a question. And a vanguardist kind of notion of organizing the people. In the 80s, before the unbanning of the ANC, there was, during apartheid, forms and levels of organization at a street level, which was a different kind of democracy. And it was similar to, I think, notions that you were alluding to. However, with the unbanning of the ANC, I mean, there's lots being written about it. New forms of people's organization was imposed. And those forms of sort of civic organizations and that level, you know, street committees and things, was done away with. I just want to know, in terms of, I don't know about your book and your analysis, whether you take into consideration, you know, that there was actually different forms of organization before we have, you know, ANC branches, ward committees, and all of that, that speak to some of the issues that you're talking about.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just picking up on the idea of the question. And actually the question right at the beginning of to what extent does the country achieve the goals of the liberation struggle? And I think the question that we're missing, and it pertains to both of these, is what is liberation? What does it look like? How do we do it? How do we be liberated? Because I think that's at the root of the sort of common thing that we're trying to answer.
Thanks very much. Really excellent presentations, both Freddie and Julian. Freddie, can I ask first, on the basis of what you've presented itself, it's a very serious indictment about the type of world we occupy today. In this indictment, how would you reconcile the fact that this legal basis that you are explaining to us, it's actually a superstructural requirement of what's underpinning it? In other words, private property is what this superstructure called law actually advances and promotes to the privatization of everything. So that applies both human and otherwise. And for Julian, this notion of insurgency and citizenship, can I just ask from you the notion of citizenship as you use it? Maybe we'll see more this afternoon in the book itself. How do you stratify that? I mean, is this national citizenship you're talking about? And if so, what about the transnationals, not just as individuals, but as huge forces determining the course of events inside countries?
Thank you very much. Those are all really exciting questions to engage with. If I can just take them roughly in the order in which they were asked. If I could start with Chris. The question you phrased had two parts. The first had to do with the financial means to protest effectively, particularly to deploy legal strategies to support protests. And the second question was about social media and the means of organizing at a local level. One of the most striking things in the study of post-apartheid protest is the disproportionate role of legal NGOs like the Legal Resources Center and several others. Because we have a legal system that theoretically protects protest, protects political expression, protects explicitly a right to demonstrate, although there are limits on that right, and those limits have to do with peaceful expression in particular, which is why the number of protests counted as violent is so important. Although we have that legal system is not equally accessible. That is just simply a fact. NGOs have played a significant role in allowing some social movements, some communities, to defend themselves in the court. But that is extremely limited in terms of the overall protest across the country. Even if we put aside the questions of imbalances of power between lawyers and clients, which I will put away in parentheses for the purposes of this answer at least, even if we put away those imbalances of power, the reach of these NGOs, particularly legal NGOs, is relatively small. And it is also highly limited in the sense that most officers and most lawyers are based in the metropolis. One of the reasons why the story of insurgency and protest is urban is that the stories are told in the media, through court trials, through court records. You are more likely to have access to a news camera, to a news reporter, or to any kind of formal recognition and written down version of your protest if you have access to the courts. And you're more likely to have all of those axes if you are in Joburg, Cape Town, or Durban. You do get records of protests outside of those three metropoles, but they dominate the story. So, the financial means to support their protests through going to the courts is unquestionably limited and unquestionably unevenly distributed. That is not to say that the work that has been done in collaboration with legal NGOs is dismissible. It's not. It's played a very important role in bringing these issues and these records and these voices into a public conversation. But it is a limited role. Social media, the short answer is yes. There is a great deal of social media available to the poor in South Africa. It is one of the persistent, regular and frequent encounters of fieldwork is the spread of cell phones to every part of the country, the spread of WhatsApp in particular to every part of the country, and the ease with which over the last half dozen years or so, communication in the deepest rural areas or in the most bustling metropoles has been enhanced and enabled through social media. But we shouldn't give that an explanatory role. Social media is a form of enhancing and enabling communication, but it is not in and of itself a different means of communication. Most protests, most of the time, are organized amongst people who live near each other, who know each other, who see each other face to face, and they develop on the streets amongst people who are standing next to each other. Communication does use social media, can be enhanced through social media, but it's not dependent upon it. In terms of the 1980s, and what one might call the prehistory of the present, I think it's really important for us to find a way to talk about the past 50 or 60 years of South African history that acknowledges the significant changes that took place in the 1990s without letting them become a wall beyond which analysis doesn't take place. In other words, the protests of the 2000s and the protests of the 1980s are not two separate phenomena. They have significant differences. They have different foci, they have different locations, they often have different strategies. But they are related. There are echoes of the past in the present. There are often, bluntly, particular people who organize protests in the past, organizing protests in the present. And if we pay attention to the connections and the continuities, we can have a more nuanced take on what our post-apartheid state is. One that doesn't say everything is explained by apartheid and has been solved by replacing apartheid with a new order, but one that looks at continuities and changes as being in a continuing dynamic with each other. And I think the protests of the 1980s can be used to help us understand the protests of today and the forms of local organization street sociology, to use Colin Bundy's term, that were taking place in the 1980s can valuably be used to help us come to grips with our contemporary moment. Insurgency and citizenship, and what is citizenship? One of the things I dodged around saying in the presentation, in part because it is a separate argument, but I'll try and sum it up very briefly here, is that the implication of the model of citizenship I am presenting is one that does not depend on national authority for certification. If citizenship is the ability to act, and it is not simply the ability to act within a formal structure, then there must be some form of citizenship that exceeds the state, that is not defined by and is not structured by the state's forms of recognition. I could spend a long time on this, but I suspect a long time on this would derail the rest of the conversation. What I do want to say is that struggles over formal citizenship continue to be politically important. Who gets access to what services in South Africa is not entirely determined by formal citizenship, but it does play a role. Who gets access to vote plays a role. Who is legal, who is illegal, is unquestionably important. But it is not the be-all and end-all of what it means to act as a political agent. Finally, what is liberation? I'm really not sure I can answer that question. Liberation is something that can be answered in multiple different contexts. In a context in which we speak of individuals as self-contained beings, then individual autonomy and freedom in the liberal model of action might be liberation. If we don't accept that, and if we are not willing to accept an idea that we are autonomous, individual, free agents without connection to each other, without community connections, then the freedom and liberation of the individual is not sufficient. And if we are not willing to accept, as I don't think many of us in the room are willing to accept, that individual agency and individual autonomy has any meaning outside of a reorganization of the economic base, then we can't accept individual rights as the end for individual liberation, as the end of liberation. Liberation requires something else. I think the something else is a question that we have to keep asking.
Really?
Thank you very much for the comments and the questions. The issue of resources. As I indicated, law is a power game. It tells you who has power and who doesn't, and who has resources and who doesn't. And that is not only at the level of courts, that's also at the level of how resources are allocated. The fact that it was a struggle to find amendments that related to how Zulus did X, Y, Z, and it was very easy to find the latest tax amendment, tells you who has power and who doesn't, who has resources and who doesn't. Perhaps I need to pair that one with the question that was asked about property. I have a colleague of mine who is persistent in asking this question, that during the CODESA negotiations, who gave up what? And who gained what? And if you analyze the property clause, it will tell you who gave up what and who gained what. Liberation, what is liberation? Part of liberation is just the right to be who I am. I would like to be myself, because we are in a new era. Under colonialism, I couldn't be myself. Under apartheid, I couldn't be myself. We have negotiated this settlement, I still cannot be myself. Professor Nxumalo says that traditional groups, when they went to CODESA, all what they wanted was, can we be ourselves? Of course, that wasn't granted. Now, I asked the question about the cases that went to the Constitutional Court. I'm not anti-feminism, but I have problems with cases like the Bear case, the one that declared the primogeniture rule to be unconstitutional, meaning that You know, in the African setup, you inherit using gentlemen as opposed to ladies. But the court said that was unconstitutional. But according to the African understanding, there is a reason. Not even one person raised the issue that according to the African system, we have duties, not rights. The one who inherits is not supposed to run away with the money. The one who inherits has duties to those that he's supposed to take care of. That is what's not realistic. The research on legal pluralism, I wasn't aware of it, but that's me. The Mandela issue. I must say, I went to bed last night a bit disappointed that she lost. Not because she's the mother of the nation, but because she had a point to make. But according to the Xhosa culture, when a man divorces, there are certain duties that arise from there. I'm sorry if there was a will. According to the Xhosa culture, do we have a concept of a will? Look, I'm sorry there was a will. So he had duties to his family and to this one that he's leaving behind. But from my following of the case, I had a feeling that those duties were not properly executed, and that is what she wanted to accept. But if you ask me why she lost, she went into a wrong system, which is confrontational. And the winner takes all. And she came out empty-handed. So if we want to begin to remedy the system, we need to begin to withdraw and hold back and not go into these institutions that are designed to make us confront each other. What I'm suggesting is not new. Mahatma Gandhi, apparently, he never liked the whole idea of litigating, of me versus you. No. He said it is pointless to have neighbors litigating against each other. Because for the future, they're still going to be neighbors. You are ruining this friendship or this neighborliness that exists. Rather mediate. And which is one of the core elements of the African legal system, that it mediates. There's one last point I wanted to raise about the resources. Becoming a lawyer in South Africa or studying law in South Africa unfolds also within a background with socio-economic realities. I also want to uplift my mother at home because we grew up under very appalling situations. So I cannot graduate, be admitted, and do pro bono work and get nothing. I'll be abandoning duties on the home front. And if I pick up African customary law, it doesn't pay. So I'm just trying to say the system itself tells you who has power and who doesn't. The system discourages you from being useful to your own people. As a lawyer myself, when I go home and then traditional issues arise, I'm useless because the African protocol kicks in. The system runs, and I'm left outside, and I'm supposed to be alone. I hope I'm communicating the challenges.
Thank you, Freddie. It's time for the next round of questions, but first, you know, Mahatma Gandhi was asked what he thought of Western civilization. He said he thought it was a good idea. Anyway, on the question of the will, his great opponent, Winston Churchill, said, "Where there's a will, I want to be in it," he said. Now, time for the next round of questions. Hands, looking around.
I just have a question for Julian. Julian, you spoke about citizens' organizations which exist, or you say they should exist outside the state. They want to be engage the state on the basis of equality. They should be independent of the state. But what I was hearing was citizens' organizations protesting against the state. Is there anything else that they can do apart from protesting against the state? Is there a role for for citizens' organizations to work with the state or to work with other elements in civil society and be more than just organizations of protest?
thank you, presenter Fred. I will be honest to you that when you were doing your presentation, I was highly provoked. You know, there are certain things that you don't know about it and you don't ask questions about it. And it takes an analytical mind to bring it up. My question is this: you know, in the world today, South African Constitution has been known and celebrated as one of the most progressive constitutions. And I'm not sure that there's any opposing end to it. To my best of my knowledge, I see that both blacks and whites celebrate it and also take it as a kind of pride. But my question is this: is it really progressive in the sense of the customary aspect of it? That is my take. Then secondly, I also subscribe to the notion that law, as it stands, is still a power play. You know, most times, like the Catholic Church, of which I also a member of, I belong to, there are some certain laws that they are opposed to, covertly or overtly. Is there any other institution that opposes the South African Constitution? That's my question.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is James from UK. My question is basically on the nature of this protest that we have in South Africa post-apartheid. That 22 years into democracy, we still have much more reliance onto violence as a means to voice our frustrations. And this violence is not only perpetuated by those who are voicing their frustrations, but also from those who are trying to manage those protesters, like the state, trying to, thwart those protests through the use of violence itself. So my question is, are we a society that embraces violence as a means of voicing out our frustrations, or is it something that we inherited from our colonial past, which embraced violence or which institutionalized violence as a means of thwarting these protests? Because I'm saying this coming from the perspective that we have seen a lot of these protests, especially in institutions of higher learning, where today, as a student, before you get to university, I think we've now become a society that will make you, think of, getting a bulletproof vest, as part of your stationery before you get to the university itself. I'm saying this because of the level of violence that we see as a result of these protests. So my question is, are we a society that is much more reliant on violence, or is it something that we inherited from our legacy of apartheid and colonialism? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My name is Sandy Lememela. I'm from Deep Loop in Soweto. Legend has it that Mzala, who has brought us all here together, would write responses to his own arguments if there were no responses. And sometimes he would contradict himself just to stimulate thinking and dialogue. And what I want to do is maybe to problematize and challenge some of the ideas that are presented and what they mean. The first one for me, Julian, is the whole idea of the poor in South Africa. It's a much bandied about concept or idea. And yet I think, personally, it's misleading just to use material condition to determine poverty, especially in South Africa. It's something that we need to interrogate, because I would want to know who you're referring to, Julian, when you're referring to the poor, and how do you define that poverty? I'm saying this because you must remember that the worst form of poverty is spiritual and intellectual poverty. And when you look at the poor Africans, I think they're very rich in terms of resilience, in terms of courage, in terms of determination. So it's just a question of problematizing them. So yeah, the thing of a one-dimensional way of looking of poverty must be problematized. Now, what do you say about a guy who is poor and then he wins a lotto tomorrow? Is he now rich? You know, and that's the thing. Now, you see these poor people, and this connects to what he was saying. These poor people have indigenous knowledge systems, they have languages, they have history, they have heritage, they have identity that is not acknowledged or recognized in this country, and they are referred to as the poor. But what is interesting, and this is what is becoming a pattern even at this kind of function, is that when they are not recognized, they are spokespersons in the NGOs, are people who are fluent in English, people who are qualified with degrees. They become the spokesperson, and then we assume that no, they can't speak for themselves. And then now this connects to what Freddie was saying here. You know, he was very brutally frank and sobering and somewhat pessimistic and depressing. But what I see, if I simplify things, because he actually confirms my understanding of myself. What I've always known about myself, born and bred in Diepkloof in Soweto, was, what the hell is African about me? What is African about me? Maybe there was a time when people who looked like me were Africans. But I don't know what is African about me. In fact, Fred, if I were to oversimplify your argument and connect it to what Eddie Maluka was saying earlier, we would say God created men who may have been black, and then the black man evolved into a white man, and the white man was in power, and he recreated the black man in his image. That's why today, as Africans, with this kind of constitution, we're not represented, and me, who am I? Thank you.
Africa.
I think we're running short of time.
The question you asked, I'm struggling with it to say now, 22 years later, if we say this is the most progressive constitution, what is progressive about it? That's one. Two, who is saying that this constitution is progressive? Who? We are not yet aware of who is saying that, because the unfolding events, some of which Julian has addressed, are pointing to the fact that somewhere, somehow, things went wrong. And a greater part of it points to the Constitution. A colleague of mine was saying the other day that 22 years later, we found ourselves at the Constitutional Court asking ourselves, are the powers of the public protector binding? How didn't our negotiators know what they were saying 22 years ago? Lucky enough, we still have some of them around, the roof mayors and the Ramaphosa and the So, I'm not too sure who's saying it is progressive, but from my own presentation and my own understanding, in as far as African people are concerned, it is not progressive. ask the king of the Abatembu Abatembu nation, who is in jail now, and say, is our constitution progressive? When asked Tony Leon, what is his name again? Tony Leon, who was taken to task for just celebrating the fact that he has bought a house and he slaughtered and he was taken to task. Ask the Zulu king in this province, who was taken to court for performing a tradition which goes far back, called Ukweshana, which is a beautiful ceremony for Zulu people. But he was taken to task. So is our constitution progressive? If you ask adherents of this system that I am talking about, I don't know. The violence bit, I'm going to Julian, I don't know. Who am I? You know, I always say we are all sophisticated of it. 2 weeks ago, there was a presentation of somebody who was making on Ubuntu. And he started off by saying, putting a picture of then and now. And then he put the Khoisan people around the fire with loincloths and what, and said that was African customary system. And then the second one, he put a picture which looked like Singapore and said it's now. I'm still an African. I can be an African and send my kids to St. Stephen or the school next door. I'm still an African. In 1962, when the odds were against him, Mandela decided this is the final moment, I'm going to represent myself, and the best thing to do is to wear my Xhosa regalia, to show that if I die, I'm going to die as an African. So whether in Deep Kloof or in Ngandla, doesn't matter. It is neutral. I always look at moments when there is a crisis to determine whether people are faithful to what matters to them. And you realize, like I said earlier, the African protocol kicks in. You will see who is who when a moment of crisis presents itself. I think I'm done.
Great, once again, thanks very much. I'll try and tackle those questions in the order they were asked. The first question was about citizens' organizations' engagements with the state outside of forms of protest. I think the first thing to say here is that it's important not to draw too sharp a distinction between protesting organizations and engaging organizations. Very often, the same communities are doing both. So at one point in an argument or a struggle, a community will take to the street. At another point, it will have an effective engagement with the ward councillor, and the protest will end or not take place in the first place. I think when we look at communities of the poor, and I'll come to that in a moment, over time, we see, instead of simple moments of protest, as it's often reported, we see a series of complex interactions and complex developments, of which protest is the most prominent and the most visible of the repertoire of political action available, but it is rarely the only one. A community will say over and over and over again, we have taken to the streets as a last resort. You will have to hunt high and low to find a community that says protest was their first attempt to engage with the state. It's also often not their last. So that the protest marks a moment in an ongoing relationship between local communities and their organizations and the state. And I think although it's the most prominent one, and although it is the prevalence of protest that allows us to ask the questions about what kind of politics can take place outside of the state, it's not the end answer to those questions. It's the inciting factor. In terms of violence, South Africa again is not unique in having violent protests, nor is it unique in having violent university protests, and nor is it unique in having protests that are violently suppressed by the police. I'd be very slow to say that there is anything specific in the South African culture or South African society that leads us to be more likely to embark upon violence than others. With that said, there is no doubt that there is a repertoire of violent actions that are publicly available and immediately recognizable. Violence is a regular tool of protest, it's a regular tool of dissent and of disruption. And I think, and I simply cannot give you a fully satisfactory answer to your question, and I'm not sure anyone can. But I think that the only way to begin to answer it is to begin to break down what we mean by violence. It is a huge, overwhelming word. Violence can be the structural violence of exclusion. It can be a specific act. It can be burning a tire on a highway. After all, we are very likely to hear about violent protests when the most violence is a tire being burnt. Those are then rolled in together with violence in which people are assaulted, violence in which people are killed. I think we have to spend some time picking apart these different acts and these different moments before we can begin to make any strong claims about what role violence plays in protest politics. Finally, the poor. What do I mean? Who am I talking about? And why? The technical answer is that in the long version of this answer in the book, what I'm trying to suggest is what's unusual about the politics of, quote-unquote, the poor in contemporary South Africa is that it's a politics of communities organizing themselves under the name of the poor. They are describing themselves as poor, as excluded, as impoverished, as the subjects of massive social and economic inequality. And that definition is not dependent on a particular poverty datum line, on a particular income per day. It is dependent on a politicized understanding of inequality in this particular context. And so although I am using the poor as a shorthand in this presentation, for that I apologize, what I am attempting to do is use the terms on which the politics of these communities are playing out. And this is why I think service delivery protest, as a term for these protests, while important in identifying certain triggering features, is insufficient. Because it's a protest that goes beyond claims for the delivery of services to be provided by the state, and it's a set of protests within which a politicized identity, a class that doesn't fit necessarily into our accepted and ordinary class frameworks, is being articulated. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of the session. Lunch beckons, but I think it would be most remiss of me to let you go away without a warm round of applause for the speakers and gratitude to them for their wonderfully provoking talks and also the very interesting questions posed by the audience. So, under the powers vested in me, go to lunch.
Okay, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Bengu, who's going to be chairing this next session, which is Intersections of Race, Class and Gender in Marxism.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, sorry, afternoon. We have two papers here. The first paper is Mobilizing Through a Left-Wing Community of Practice by Dr. Jenny Carson, and the other paper is by Dr. Bonnie Lewis, says using Marxist economic theory to understand race and gender ideology. Just briefs on the two presenters. Dr. Jenny Carson says here for 10 years, Dr. Jenny Carson has been engaged in various 10 months capacities to establish and set up the Mzala Center for this kind of South African society. Prior to this, she taught research and education policy for almost 10 years at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. From 1983 to 2004, J. Nicholson worked in various non-governmental organizations in Durban as an librarian, project coordinator, researcher, and manager. She has a master's degree in information studies from the University of Natal and a PhD in education from the University of London, UK, for her visual study of apartheid and post-apartheid discourses in school space. Let's give a warm welcome to her.
Thank you very much. Thank you. The Mzala Center for the Study of South African Society, which I'll refer to as the Mzala Center, was established in July 2015. And one of its aims is to commemorate and take forward the legacy of the left-wing intellectual Jabulani nobleman Mzala Nxumalo. 6 guiding principles were identified in an early draft of a funding proposal. And in this paper, I explore the first of these principles. And that principle is an intellectual and inquiring left-wing community of practice. The purpose is to sharpen the shared understanding of how the centre, and indeed even the Friends of Mzala, might function and interact as an intellectual community and respond to the conditions within South African society. The paper has 3 parts. In the first, I explore the phrase left-wing community of practice, which references Wenger's work on ways of working and learning as an organization and group. And in the second part, I turn to the accounts of 2 people who knew Mzala and talk about his activism. And in the final part, I conclude by discussing the insights that I've gleaned. So let's turn to this guiding principle. The communities of practice are associated with collective learning. Wenger states that they are groups of people who share a concern or a passion for something they do, and they learn how to do it better as they interact regularly. He isolates 3 characteristics that are present in a community of practice and which distinguish it from other groups of people. And these are the domain, or commitment to a shared area of interest. Secondly, the community of a set of members or people who interact, do things together, and share information and build relationships. And the third aspect of community of practice is the practice, developed over time and through sustained interactions such as peer-to-peer learning or a shared repertoire of resources, ideas, tools, experiences, and ways of addressing particular problems. By citing community of practice as part of its first principle, the founders of the Mzala Center imply that the members and staff will share a domain or commitment to a particular area of interest. That members and staff will interact and do things together, sharing information and building relationships, and that over time and through sustained interaction, they'll develop a shared repertoire of resources, ideas, tools, and experiences to address particular problems. The particularities of their area of interest, their repertoire of resources, and the nature of the problems they seek to tackle is deduced from the type of community of practice mentioned in the principle. And the words in the principle are that it is an intellectual, inquiring, and left-wing community of practice. Now, these words give us insight into the Mzala Center's social locus. It is to construct knowledge and understanding using a left-wing theoretical frame, because the domain is intellectual and left-wing. It is research-oriented because the practice is intellectual and inquiring, and these are hallmarks of social science research. So clearly, the organizational community is envisaged as sharing a left-wing perspective and understanding of society, and thus the particular societal questions and problems that the Mzala Center seeks to address are located along a left-right social continuum. So seen through a left-wing lens, the problems are thus associated with the right wing, and those are the problems. They're associated with the right wing and centrist positions and conditions within South Africa and the broader international context that hold those positions. Thus, for the community of practice within the Mzala Center, knowledge and learning are aligned with and intrinsic to the left-wing position on the continuum. I want to turn to this term left-wing and briefly reflect on its origins and what it implies. And I'm using the work of scholars Rosas and Ferreira. They remind us that with most of humanity being right-handed across language and culture, the term right and its associations are given a positive spin, and the converse is true for the term left, and they trace the political origins of left and right wing to the French court in the late 18th century, where supporters of the king and the status quo sat to his right, and those favouring democracy and the republic were to his left. So this dichotomy of right wing, representing the retention of tradition and the entrenchment of the status quo, and left wing, representing radical ideas that dispute convention and challenge the established power, continues into the 21st century. And now we find it being embedded in the DNA of the Mzala Center by way of the organization's first guiding principle, which commits the center to this left-wing community of practice. It seeks to distinguish the Mzala Center from other research and knowledge construction entities through the explicit discursive stance that is associated with Mzala, namely a Marxist position. Since I'm not a Marxist scholar, I don't have a political science or a philosophy background, I turned to Jacques Derrida's discussion of the ghosts or spectres of Marx in a post-Cold War neoliberal era in order to move closer to what a Marxist community of practice might mean in 2016. And I'm drawing on his book, sorry, I didn't put the year in, Spectres of Marx. Derrida's lectures, this book, is based on a two-part lecture he presented in April 1993 at an international colloquium on the theme of Whether Marxism, held in Riverside, California. His lectures are tied poignantly to us today in that he dedicates the lectures to one of Mzala's comrades, Chris Hani, who had been assassinated April 10, only a few days before that original colloquium in California. And Derrida writes in the dedication, referring to Chris Hani, this popular hero of the resistance against apartheid became dangerous and suddenly intolerable, it seems, at the moment in which, having decided to devote himself once again to a minority communist party riddled with contradictions, he gave up important responsibilities in the ANC and perhaps any official political or even governmental role he might one day have held in a country freed of apartheid. Close quote. I thought you'd be interested in hearing that connection to us locally. I feel out of my depth in reading somebody like Derrida, as I often do with other French philosophers. His argument is like a richly embroidered fabric of a multi-layered 18th century Parisian costume, as he draws out the ghosts in Shakespeare's Hamlet and refutes Fukuyama's End of History and The Last Man, to name but a few of the scholars and intellectuals that he unpacks. But clearly in the lectures, he's pushing back against the dominant discourse that argues that Marxism had run its course with the fall of the Berlin Wall and Iron Curtain and is no longer relevant. He argues that this discourse that it has run its course has become hegemonic through a cultural welding together of party politics, mass media, and scholarship, and it's endangering democracy. The reader's critique of late 20th century neoliberalism is pertinent to us today. He refers to parliamentary deliberation and government decision-making that's ever distant from people. Muddy party-state relations that sound very familiar. And public and intellectual spaces upset and overrun by technology so that political leaders become mere characters in the media. He urges the reader, and by extension us today, that the Marxist inheritance is a task. He uses that word, task. Not merely to perform an interpretation of the world, or to be dog-faithful to Marx's dialectical materialism, or simply oppose the dominant discourse, but our task is to change the world. And Derrida proposes that this is done by way of a radical self-critique or reflexive questioning stance. So from this, my understanding is that the guiding principle of the Mzala Center is not about teaching Marxist dogma and reasserting the camp of traditional power and practice, although there's a place for that. And it's not about stoning the hegemonic establishment and status quo. It suggests that researchers of the Mzala Center should be easily identifiable and known as dissenters and reflexive critics of their own society, and through events and forms of radical self-critique, point society in new directions towards participatory, deliberative democracy and justice. So to sum up on these points about that first principle, I feel that it indicates that the Mzala Center is to be a group or community of researchers, students and scholars who share a particular understanding of social inequalities and political power that entrenches the dominant and traditional status quo, and who interact and share their learning in a way that yields radical social change. So although it's not made explicit in the first guiding principle, it's inferred that the organization is all about asking critical questions, a national question, and building new knowledge that will yield the sort of social change that gives voice to the voiceless and supports equality, justice, and shared power. If Mzala were here today, he might have said that the research and new knowledge being constructed should be informed by a Marxist understanding of society, so that the sort of social change being sought is socialist. And indeed, this is the legacy that the Mzala Center is committed to. Now I want to turn very quickly to what was his practice, if we are thinking about a community of practice. And in order to do that, I have turned to two first-hand accounts about Mzala. And the first one is about Nxumalo, and his first encounter, he refers to his first encounter of Mzala, and it's within the context of being a registered student in a place of higher learning at a student meeting. This is from a particular, the booklet that I'm remembering Mzala that you all have copies of. So I've used that as my text for his eyewitness account. And he tells us that because Nxumalo also tells us that about a decade later he rediscovered Mzala at a seminar at SOAS in London. Subsequently, Mzala recruited him to join the Communist Party, and these memories tell us that organizational structures, meetings, and events such as seminars were significant to Mzala, and he used them strategically. Nxumalo's account recalls Mzala in a meeting, and then Mzala taking the important step of exile. Nxumalo says, I can still remember Mzala's voice on the evening of the 17th of June 1976. It was a Thursday. We were discussing how we were to respond to the brutality of the apartheid regime in Soweto. Of course, the university was closed for the rest of 1976, and that was when Mzala left for exile the The night of that meeting was possibly his last at the University of Zululand. So here we see Mzala as a youth mobilizing at meetings, not merely being present at the meetings, but mobilizing at them, using deliberation and debate. Yet Nxumalo remembers him as ready to go even beyond this and to take action with his entire life, putting his entire life on the line by going into exile. When Nxumalo re-encountered Mzala in London, they became good friends. His memories of that period give us insight into how the world of words and texts became part of Mzala's arsenal. I'm quoting him, sometimes we were debating a sentence, one sentence. What do you think Lenin meant by this sentence? And we would debate for hours until we missed our transport. Here we learn that Mzala was not reading political texts merely to get the general gist of the author's thought. Rather, he undertook close qualitative readings and discourse analysis that involves deconstruction, exegesis, and interpretation of words and their order, genealogy, and symbolism, as well as understanding the production process behind the text and who the audience is. But it's not a private pursuit for his own intellectual development. His analysis of what he was reading and how that was debated was a shared experience with comrades. So the process of debating and analyzing texts was a tool Mzala used. Mzala was not only engaged in decoding and deconstructing texts, but also in constructing his own authored texts. Nxumalo describes Mzala as a Marxist and Leninist intellectual, producing knowledge and ideas almost non-stop. The audience was an important consideration for Mzala. We understand this from Nxumalo's account when he says that Mzala wrote about politics in isiZulu and translated the Communist Manifesto into isiZulu. So the picture emerging is that Mzala's approach to mobilizing for social change involved reading, studying, writing, and translating. And I had already mentioned debating. Running out of time. He also points to Mzala's use of pen names, and that it wasn't a peculiar practice of Mzala's, it was common amongst those in exile. But he explains that the strategy of pen names was used for purposes of security, but also that Mzala enjoyed doing this and derived pleasure from it. His serious purpose was to try and generate a debate and a discussion. So 6 points we glean from Nxumalo's memory or eyewitness account that Mzala used: participating in organized structures and their processes, attending and participating in meetings and educational events such as seminars, reading texts and engaging in discourse analysis and debate, writing texts and translating them using pen names, and taking direct action, as in going to exile, becoming a soldier. The second eyewitness is John Daniel. And just 3 points that I gleaned from his account, where he talks about meeting Mzala again in London. And his account confirms many of the things we've already gleaned about Mzala from Nxumalo, especially about him being a political writer. It's clear that Mzala took Daniel into his confidence by telling him about his underground military activities on the border between Swaziland and South Africa. And Daniel says, when I got to know him, he told me that when he had disappeared, he was inside Ngwavuma. He spent many months organizing inside South Africa. Mzala was part of the small team, many of whom did not survive, who were sent inside Ngwavuma to organize opposition to the planned adjustment of South Africa's borders. Thus again, we are learning that Mzala's approach to social change was to work with and through organizational structures. On this occasion, those of the ANC's military wing, Mkhonto Wesizwe. He was a soldier carrying arms, mobilizing within the resistance and putting his life in danger. Daniel also talks about discovering his aliases, and that he suddenly realized he'd known him but under a different name. And as I mentioned, taking direct action as a soldier. So that I'm concluding now with some of the insights that from this would like to propose and confirm that the Mzala Center would be an institutional space for a left-wing reflexive group of social science researchers and activists. And that this way of working would be collaborative. And we learned from Derrida's explanation of a new Marxist approach that it would be a radical critique. And here, perhaps we, especially with the theme of this particular session, thinking of how that would cover the intersection of race, class, and gender, and how that's shaped materially and socially by the neoliberal nexus that Derrida referred to, the political, the media, and the public space being overrun and muddied, the differences between those. And the Mzala Center would also employ a repertoire of strategies intent on pushing daily lived experience, what some would call the quotidienne, towards utopian ideals, perhaps, such as a more participatory, deliberative democracy, where living is good and fair, and where the notion of a common good is realized, not just enshrined in texts like the Constitution. So synthesizing and distilling some of those points of the strategies that Mzala used and taking them, we could interpret them as I've done on the right-hand side of this table and see how the Mzala Center could play out these and run with these this repertoire of practice. I'll leave you with that.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Very interesting and quite relevant for the center. I just, it speaks very well also about some of the things that were mentioned by Nxumalo in the earlier session around expectations of what the center is to become. So I find this presentation very, very interesting. So I'm hoping that people that are within the board and those who are within the center are going to engage with this vigorously. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Professor Polly Lewis. She's from the Texas State University, and the brief here it says she's an assistant professor of philosophy at Texas State University, where she specializes in political philosophy, the ethics of revolutionary change, and the study of creative practices. Dr. Lewis holds a PhD from the European Graduate School in Media and Philosophy and MA from the University of Pennsylvania in Comparative Culture and Politics, and an MFA in Fiction from New York University. She is the author of The Politics of Everybody, Feminism, Queer Theory, and Marxism at the Intersection. Lewis's specialty is Marxist political economy and debates in gender. Her specific interest has been in critiquing the voluntarist countercultural sentiment in Western queer politics by bringing in an economic analysis based on feminist reading of capital. Let's welcome
Hi everyone. So I was told that I originally wrote my paper for a 30-minute talk, and we just got cut down. So I'm going to speak quickly. I hope not too quickly, because I know I speak with an accent. But first, I would like to thank the Mzala Center for inviting me here today. I've learned so much about South African politics, and I know that others have said that they're humbled by being here, but I'm truly humbled by being in the presence of so many intellectually courageous comrades. And I'm excited to become a friend of Mzala, and I look forward to reading his work and sharing it with other Marxists in the United States. The question that I'm going to be asking this afternoon concerns the phenomenon of two social categories that at once seem to be self-evident and utterly mystifying: race and gender. They seem to be self-evident because in our two nations, the United States and South Africa, life is endlessly sorted by race, and our societies, along with every other society in the world, is ordered by gender norms. Still, these concepts mystify us, even as they continue to define and confine us. We ask ourselves, are race and gender socially constructed terms? If so, why have they been constructed, and who constructed them? And why is it so difficult to deconstruct or reconstruct race and gender on more equitable bases? To examine these questions today, I will rely heavily on the work of the African-American Marxist scholar, Barbara J. Fields. I will be limiting my analysis to the history of race and gender in the US context, not because I assume that the form American racism and sexism takes is universal, but precisely the opposite. The parameters of sexism and racism in the United States are shaped by a very particular history of capitalist social relations. And I hope that the examination of the ideology of race and gender in the United States will spark comparisons of how racism and sexism operate in the South African context. I've learned here that Comrade Mzala said that understanding economic injustice is key to the national question. And in that spirit, I will examine how racism and sexism secure the economic injustice that was and is foundational to the United States as a nation. So the first question we'll ask today is, what is race in the United States, and what does it mean for an American to be black or white? In the 19th and 20th century, American understandings of race were distorted by the political pseudoscience called the one-drop rule. So one drop of African blood resulted in a verdict of racial blackness. So let's note the bizarreness of this metaphor, because there is no such thing as racialized blood. To put this another way, until recently in the United States, there was not really such a thing as mixed race. Although the American slave trade was founded on the usefulness of visible differences between people, the one-drop rule added a dimension of invisibility, of secret racialness, of racial poisoning. Therefore, in the US, race is a contradiction. It is completely obvious on the surface, and also undetectable to the eye. If you had one ancestor who was black, you were defined by that one ancestor, and you were subject to enslavement and segregation. But just as developing a visual marker of difference between English indentured servants and African slaves was profitable for the slave system, so was the one-drop rule. This is because Africans were not just workers, but also commodities to be traded. And that meant that slave owners could impregnate black women and then sell their offspring as commodities. If the infant was something other than black, something called white or mixed race, this would confuse the dehumanizing rhetoric that allowed slavers to sell their own children. If a slave with 3 white grandparents and 1 black grandparent was white instead of black, in other words, the slave owners would literally lose the commodity value of that person. So defining racial blackness as broadly as possible was good business. In the 20th century, after slavery was overturned, the one-drop law had a different function. It kept black proletarians disenfranchised, and it pressured working-class descendants of Europeans to be invested in the idea of whiteness as a social value. This was the continuance of a ruling class project already long underway. In the 17th century, slave owners needed to quell the labor unrest caused by English indentured servants and African slaves joining forces. Such rebellions were not uncommon, as 60% of the English indentured servants died before earning their freedom. The slave owners solved the problem by deputizing white servants to be the police of enslaved blacks. But after a few generations, the solidarity between servants and slaves was shattered, and we have the birth of the US police force. So developed race in America. Whites could be discovered to be black. But it's also important to remember that 80% of black Americans have ancestors of European descent as well, with some having over 50% European ancestry. But black blood was not the only secret blood with magical properties. Jews were specifically thought to be a race of people who masqueraded as white in order to undermine whiteness. So for whites, race can be slippery. But where whites can slide into blackness, the reverse is never true. Black people, even black people with white mothers, like President Barack Obama, are always black. Perhaps the most bizarre recent American story about race, something only possible in a society where the one-drop rule was once internalized as fact, is the truly weird story of Rachel Dolezal, a blonde, blue-eyed woman of European descent who permed and braided her hair, claimed she understood the black experience, and went on to become a successful African-American professor and black civil rights leader. That is until her family contacted the media and said that she's completely of European descent. But Dolezal isn't alone in her hope of abandoning whiteness now. Whereas once whites would rather die than take a transfusion of this black blood, some white people now are taking DNA tests in hopes that their results come back with markers of a sub-Saharan lineage. Now, one drop of so-called black blood now has the power to absolve whites from the legacy of racism. With one drop, they can claim that they were once the victims of American history instead of perhaps being descended from victimizers. But of course, blackness and whiteness, as the comrade discussed this morning, have nothing to do with genetics and everything to do with the ideology of political economy. To understand blackness in America, one must first understand racism. To help understand this phenomenon, historian Barbara Field first reiterates what human genome scientists have long said. There is no such thing as genetic race, no such thing as genetic DNA, and no such thing as racialized blood. The difference between blacks and whites, not to mention the difference between other recently invented American races like Jews and now Mexicans, or like the long-gone 19th century races of Europe, the Teutonic race, Alpine race, the Slavic race, and the Irish race, are purely social, not genetic phenomena. So according to Field, she reminds us nature did not invent distinct human kinds. Fields infers a conclusion from this premise. If distinct human kinds do not exist, then political phenomena cannot spontaneously emerge out of relationship between distinct human kinds. In other words, racism is not the product of unjust race relations or a souring of attitudes between different kinds of people. Instead, Fields argues that racism is not a product of race, rather the reverse. Race is a product of racism. Race, then, is socially managed by a phenomenon that she terms racecraft. Racecraft invokes witchcraft. The parallel here for Fields is that witches and races are invented roughly the same way. A group is delimited and then ostracized. Violence against the demonized group is maintained with bizarre interpretations of cause and effect. For example, witches can kill people's livestock with a glance. Or, in Jim Crow America, white people would fear drinking out of water fountains because black people had drunk out of them. So, to quote Fields, neither witch nor pure race has material existence. Having no material existence, they can have no material causation. Fields carefully distinguishes between race, racism, and racecraft. Race is the doctrine that nature produced human kinds in distinct groups, each defined by inborn traits that its members share. Racism refers to the theory and practice of applying a social, legal, or social, civil, or legal double standard based on ancestry, is not an emotion or a state of mind. It is a social practice, an action, and a rationale for action. Racecraft, on the other hand, is the mental terrain that must be navigated in societies shaped by racism. So to understand what Fields calls racecraft, we must understand ideology. It's common on the left to remark that socially constructed phenomena are the result of ideology. But how can we define ideology without resorting to circular reasoning? In other words, how can we define ideology without simply saying that ideology is socially constructed because ideology is that which socially constructs? Once again, Fields' ideas provide excellent guidance. She defines ideology as the descriptive vocabulary of day-to-day existence through which people make rough sense of the social reality that they live and create. Ideologies are not delusions, but real as the social relations for which they stand. Nor should ideology be confused with propaganda or doctrine. She says that ideology is a distillate of experience. Ideology is the codification of ideas that make sense in a political context. It is how individuals get around obstacles in their social terrain. And of course, in a Marxist context, this social terrain is a product of material social relations. Fields then argues that sumptuary codes emerge from ideologies to enforce social relations. A sumptuary code is an assertion of what people can or cannot wear, what they can or cannot consume, and how they should comport themselves in the presence of those who oppress them. So it was illegal in Europe for the working class to wear the clothing of royalty. It was uppity for a Jew to walk on the same sidewalk as a Christian in 19th century Vienna. And this year it was uppity for the African-American singer Beyonce and her backup singers to wear the feminine clothing of the 19th century white Southern belle. The ideology of race is maintained by obedience to sumptuary codes. Sumptuary codes that would seem absurd to someone outside the social paradigm. And that's exactly what naturalizes the idea of race. But sumptuary codes do not just naturalize race, they also naturalize gender, and that's where I'm going to turn my attention next. Is gender in the DNA, or to borrow Fields' phrase, is there such a thing as sexcraft? Gender, even more than race, is something that many people would argue is an absolute fact of nature. Indeed, there are physical markers of individuals' potential roles in human sexual reproduction. I say potential roles because sex characteristics, patterns of body hair, genitalia, bone structure, hip to waist ratio, etc., often correlate to what kind of role one plays in sexual reproduction, but not always. So we found that sometimes it turns out that individuals who were assigned to live female at birth, despite their very feminine appearance, have XY chromosomes and internal testes. Their body is genetically XY. Her body is genetically XY, but her body doesn't accept androgens. So her external primary and secondary sex characteristics are extremely feminine, even though she is genetically male. So there are three philosophical positions that people have taken regarding gender. First, there is the essentialist position that people with feminine bodies have an innate feminine spirit, independent of social structures or history. In the 20th century, this view fell out of favor because industrialization and urbanization opened the public sphere to women, and this contributed to this demise of essentialism. A new view became popularized, in part because it made sense of new economic realities. In short, the new view was that there is such a thing as standard biological sex, and that it's not mutable by history or culture. However, this other thing, gender expectations, particularly of women, are merely oppressive social constructs. Later in 20th century American philosophy, an even more provocative theory emerged. Just as the discovery of the human genome disrupted common preconceptions of race, scientific development interrupted ideas about sex. Cellular biology and neuroscience were beginning to show that male and female were less like apples and oranges and more like points on a spectrum, with most people falling on one side or the other. It is now known that at the micro level, no matter what your gender, some non-trivial portion of your cells will be coded with the Y chromosome. Recent neurology, experiments in neurology have shown that the brain of transgendered people have some brain patterning closer to the other side of the sexual spectrum. So in the language of Barbara Fields, perhaps in addition to racecraft, there is also sexcraft. So imagining how race changes the perception of gender, I think reveals the ideological basis of both. For example, we know that women are supposed to be feminine, but what does that mean? It turns out that in the American context, femininity is a class-bound concept circumscribed by race. In the 19th century American South, femininity was defined by whiteness and wealth. The Southern belle was delicate, gentle, coquettish, and childlike, all puffy skirts and parasols. In the mid-20th century, middle-class white womanhood would be pressured into adopting a similar form of femininity as a backlash against the proletarianization of women during World War II. This middle-class femininity was also an ideological weapon. The middle-class femininity was also an ideological weapon, a weapon against communism and the American labor movement. American women were said to be feminine homemakers, unlike the women of the USSR who were unfeminine industrial workers. Wealthy white women were confined to the home in the American South, and in the early 20th century American North, it was women's work in immigrant Jewish communities to run the family business and take care of the household finances while the men studied Hebrew. So Jewish womanhood was not defined by being childlike and coquettish, but by being practical and good at organizing. So by the mid-century, much of the white American feminist movement's emphasis was on fighting the doctrine of innate femininity, and Jewish women were often leading the charge. This goes back to Barbara Fields' point of ideology being a distillate of experience. So it makes historical sense that feminism in the American context connoted Jewishness, while the good Christian anti-feminist women of the American South were protecting the traditional virtues of white womanhood that had been distilled from experience, but also from a racist experience. Okay, so what about black women in America? Angela Davis notes that while white women were oppressed through forced feminization, black women slaves were dehumanized by absolute degendering and a negative equality with black men. Femininity was deemed to be innate in women, but somehow black womanhood still had to be the absolute opposite of white womanhood. This was yet another extreme consequence of the contradictions of American political ideology. Founded on liberty and equality for all men, the ruling class required a rationale for slavery, and so they invented one. Black people were not really people, and as a correlate, black women were not really women. This was a useful ideology for a slaveholder to possess. Black women could then labor in the fields as long and as hard as black men. To facilitate the commodification of black babies, slave owners had to fantasize that black women had no genuine maternal sentiment. So the only thing common to black womanhood and white womanhood was that, along with black men, we were all still childlike. Racecraft here transforms sexcraft. But racialized sexcraft does not only affect black women, it also affects black men. The ideology of hypermasculinity facilitates the argument that, and this is a white ideology, facilitates the argument that American black men are dangerous, violent, and less physically sensitive to pain than their white counterparts. Like all women, black men in the United States are expected, like all women, I should put it that way, black men in the United States are expected to follow strictly gendered sumptuary codes. They must not wear certain items of clothing, like hoodies or dark colors, and there is a veritable white hysteria over black youth sagging their pants. Attributing hypermasculinity to black women is also used to insinuate that black women are more sexual than white women, and ideological support for sexual violence against black women. White womanhood, on the other hand, must be grounded in absolute sexual purity. Virginity is then the social cue that protects against sexual violence. And the hyperfemininity attributed to white women means that she must be gentle and indirect, and therefore sexuality has to be drawn out of her. Without her virginity, her sexuality is always mysteriously right below the surface, waiting to be drawn forth by a skillful man, and therefore that's the origins of sexual violence against white women. But American racecraft and sexcraft does not end with the maintenance of blackness and whiteness. Immigrant women are also specifically gendered in the American US. And I'm not going to go into this to cut a little bit of time, but I go into, in the paper, Mexican women and Muslim women in the United States and how they're being racialized. But to end, what is Marxian political economy and why does it matter? So first of all, Marxian theory tells us to look at the material relations for insight into the origins of social problems, as opposed to vague notions of culture or biological essences or people's bad ideas. Marxism shows us that capitalism operates through the seizure of resources. Second, capitalism generates profit by organizing the human labor power of workers to produce surplus value. Profit is increased by making workers work longer or faster, by pushing wages down, and most importantly, for understanding racecraft and sexcraft under capitalism, profits can be made by lowering the cost of the labor commodity itself. So what is the value of commodified labor power? Its value is the inputs that go into the worker's existence, his or her food, his or her hygiene and healthcare, the child rearing that makes his or her life possible in the first place. So the literal reproductive labor of his or her mother is involved. It's cheaper to keep workers alive. The cheaper it is to keep workers alive, to get them to work the next day, the cheaper labor is. Women are the name of the people tasked to do this care. And not only at low cost, usually for free. Not only are women tasked to do it, their role is reinforced by the ideological laudation of motherhood and women's self-sacrifice. But then women serve other roles as well, including roles as workers. Women also function as a reserve army of labor, as a surplus population that could be brought into the economy to explicitly lower wages. Therefore, sexist dehumanization and racist dehumanization devalue labor as a whole. By extension, the acceptance of sexism and racism drag down the whole of the labor movement. I'm going to jump ahead here. In summation, the ideologies of sexism and racism are not born from our needs, they're born from the needs of capital and its colonial legacy. Usually, our ideologies are maintained because they provide explanatory power. They provide a sense of identity. For the oppressed, they provide a legacy of courage in political history. But another reason is because, as Field says, we are bewitched by race and gender, and we see them as causes instead of as effects of social power. So to get ourselves out from under the spell, we must turn our attention to the economic rationale behind exploitation and oppression, both historically and in our present situations.
Thank you very much, Toby. Very interesting papers. So we will open the time for questions. I will probably allow 4 questions for the first round, and then give back to the presenters to make a response. Can I ask that start by introducing yourself? Please don't introduce the question. Just introduce yourself and go to the question or comment, not necessarily having to reintroduce it as well. Thank you. 4 hands.
Thank you. I'm Wale Olayopo from UKZN. My question is basically about the gender and race ideology. You said that an ideology is a descriptive of the day-to-day people's experience in order to enforce social relations. So basically, it has a function of regulating relationship in the society, but it's mostly on attitude and people's belief of reality. So if those construct ideology are human constructs, they are human constructs, they are created. It's not as if they are backed up by any empirical studies. Like you said, our DNA is basically the same. So why is it very difficult to deconstruct some of these issues? For example, when we were growing up, we were made to believe that a particular race is superior. But from my interaction with other races, I don't see any superiority anywhere. So what is stopping us? When we know that it's a particular class that is using that kind of ideology to exploit the majority, then what stops us from deconstructing all those belief systems? And secondly, you said something about sanctuary codes, obeying those sanctuary codes. What does sanctuary codes, what does it mean? What do you mean by sanctuary code? Thank you.
Thanks very much. I really enjoyed both papers. I have just a comment to make on Jenny's. Jenny, you spoke about a community of practice within the Mzala Center. But if the purpose of the Mzala Center, one of its main purposes, is to reinvigorate left-wing progressive thinking in South African society, and it's also called the Study for the Center of South African Society, could we not be looking at making a much broader community of practice involving academics, students, intellectuals outside of the universities, and find ways of building links and encouraging debates, and see that whole thing as being a community of practice?
Jonathan Grady from UKZN. I think this is the second time I'm asking a question. My question is directed to Dr. Lewis. I found that a very interesting presentation. I just want to throw a spanner into the works. It's about relating to the means of production and the material base of production. There's this like futurist narrative that I've been picking up about the proliferation of, or the future proliferation of means of production and relations of production which will render the current system obsolete. Talking about things like 3D printing, robotics, all of that stuff. Will it completely displace relations as we know them, or will the distribution, creation, and dispersion of all of these things still be rolled out along the same stratification of society as Marxists see it? Thanks.
I'll just respond to John's comment to say, yes, I agree with you. This is a work in progress. So I do touch, I think in the last slide, there was an allusion to the broader partnerships and linkages. So I agree 100% with you.
Okay, I'm going to start with the first question. First thing I want to say is that what I was saying was Barbara Field's term is sumptuary codes. And what the sumptuary comes from the term consumption, right? So a sumptuary code is a code of what somebody is allowed to consume in a society and how they're allowed to behave, right? So, the idea that a woman must dress in a feminine manner, that is a sumptuary code, right? A rather circular one as well. A woman must dress like a woman. The idea in the United States that black men are not allowed to sag their pants or have their pants hang down. I mean, this really is like this crazy hysteria in white people that I really can't explain. That's another example of a sumptuary code. So it's a code of how you can consume things and how you can interact with others, how you can take space in a society. But to answer the question about the ideology of race, I wasn't saying you have the ideology of racism. I think that's different than the ideology of race. Fields has a really good analogy for this, and she says that ideology is like red lights. It's like stopping at an intersection. We all live in a society. We live in societies where we have intersections that are modified by lights, and we know when we're supposed to stop, and we know when we're supposed to start. And it seems like it makes sense, good reason. We stop because we don't want to have our car hit. But then when we go out to the desert, and it's 3 o'clock in the morning, and there's nobody around, and there's a red light, and we go, I don't know, should I go, right? That's when ideology is kind of taken hold. That's when we know that we've internalized an ideology. It doesn't make sense in the world anymore. So the ideology of race and gender wouldn't be the ideology of racism, right? The ideology of race would be something along the lines of, I have a black identity, or I have a strong identity as a woman, because this is the identity I've used to survive, right? It's a constructed identity that's given me strength, and I want to hold on to that. Some folks use biology in order to concretize this point, right? You know, well, I must be inherently different than a European person, or I must be inherently different from a man. And I need that inherent difference to resource this, to gain the resource of the specialness inside of me. So I think that that's a very rational response to living in a racist society or living in a sexist society. But it also throws problems out there as well that make it difficult to do something like deconstruct race or deconstruct gender when it comes to a practical aspect. So to get on to Jonathan's questions about this seems to me a question about transhumanism, and I'm actually really glad that you brought it up. I mean, the first thing I would say is that I think that Marx's Capital tells us that there is no technological solution to a problem of social relations, right? And one of the reasons would be where I stand on this idea of the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall due to machines. And one of the things that I skipped in the paper was when I talk about how Marx says that instead of using horses in England, one of the bosses used women to do the job of horses, because he says horses have a definite value, whereas women are below all comprehension of value. This happened again in Mexico during an earthquake. This happens quite a lot, where the bosses, when there was a company where it was seamstresses, during the earthquake, they rushed in to save the sewing machines, and they let the workers die. Why? Well, because the machines cost something up front. There's no profit in them. There's something that you need to do to gain short-term profits over your competitors, and they become normalized in the system, and you're stuck having to buy them. But you have to outlay money up front. You could kill off all the workers tomorrow and replace them. All they represent is a wage, a per hour, right? It doesn't matter if it's you or me, it just matters getting those people there. So dehumanizing really, really does that work. So I don't think that machines under a system of capitalist social relations will change those social relations. We change, the human changes, we change, or to say that those with agency, we change it intentionally. We'd have to change that system intentionally. Now, I think that certainly when we move into different technological horizons, we need to discuss how technology is shifting those debates, is shifting debates about race and gender as well. For example, the Human Genome Project is based on technology and technological advancements. We wouldn't have known these things. We wouldn't have been able to argue that there's no DNA basis for race if we didn't have that technology, right? So there's effects that happen, but I do not believe that there will be a technological solution to a problem of human social relations.
Thank you. Any other round of questions? Well, because we still have about 5 minutes, maybe we can give you guys to have the last statements.
I would just pick up on something that Holly has just mentioned in terms of the intentionality, and that perhaps that's what my paper is also trying to say, is that Mzala intentionally was using this repertoire, or I'm picking out from these memory accounts this repertoire of techniques or strategies, if we could call them, and not hoping, but that I can see how through the way in which we're wanting to proceed with the Mzala Center, that there will be intentionality of the approach that we will use to roll out the program and to achieve the social purposes that we want.
Yeah, and to connect to Jenny's paper on the idea of building community, one of the things I think that I'm very taken by Barbara Fields' definition of ideology as a distillation of experience, because that means that what we do and how we interact with one another is valuable. What we do and how we interact with one another not only makes changes in the world, but it makes changes in us. And it's that dialectical relationship about changing the world and changing ourselves through communication and interaction with one another that makes those larger changes possible. And I think that does boil down to building these communities of dialogue and building these communities of debate. And I love the way that Mzala's rhetoric, of this story, and then somebody back there said it's not a story, it's true. That Mzala, wrote and then argued with himself. I think this is exactly what we need on the left. Having been having been a part of Marxist organizations, I don't know how many times I've been told to go into a room and tell people a line or, give an answer. When one of the other presenters talked about this, that Marxism is about beginning with a question, and that questioning that Mzala did is really, I think, something that is Marxism could stand to learn a lot from that around the world. Yeah. And that's all. And once again, thanks so much for being here. I've learned, for allowing me to be here, and I've learned so much from everybody, and I'm really looking forward to learning more as well.
Thank you. I see there's a researching question. Researching breaking.
All right, I think I'm asking this question out of curiosity. As South Africans, we have a tendency to beat ourselves too hard. And on the issue of racism, we do exactly that. The recent statements by the likes of Sparrow and like-minded crazy people has reminded us that we still have a long way to go in terms of dealing with racism in South Africa. But interestingly, during my sojourn in the US, I got a sense that racism in America is still alive. So many years after Americans claimed to be the proponents of a democratic dispensation. So now my question is, to what extent has America dealt with racism, and what would your advice be to us as South Africans in terms of facing racism?
I would say 0%. I think America has dealt with 0% of its problems with racism. And in fact, one of the biggest problems that we have, and I don't know if this relates at all to South African society, and this is something I would love to learn, is that most of our racism operates through a language of post-racism. Well, we're all not racist anymore. We have a black president, so why are these people in Black Lives Matter? Why are they yelling? All lives matter, right? And that's like people have said that this is like saying that going into a cancer ward and saying, why are you working for a cure for cancer? All diseases matter, right? It's just this idea of, it's completely absurd, right? The reason why there's an argument that Black Lives Matter is because Black lives are precisely the lives are being treated like they don't matter, right? So, but there's this language of post-racism. And what happens is that racists will say, bringing up race at this point, I'll put it this way, bringing up race in the United States will bring about calls of you are being a racist. You just won't let it die. Stop bringing up race. And of course, it's never been dealt with. And I was reading Fanon, and I was wondering if maybe it was a lack of violence in our social change, in the sense of violent uprisings. Maybe if we had more violent uprisings, there would be less racism today. I sincerely wonder that. I don't. But there is the policing in America is incredibly, unbelievably violent. I mean, horrifically violent. One thing I also want to say that may be different here, and that's that while a higher percentage of black people are in poverty in the United States, I believe it's 40%, 20% of white people are in poverty, and white people are the majority. So most impoverished people in the United States are actually white. So this is where the ideology of race construction gets to be very, very strange, because building a unified movement against capital would benefit a good number of white people, but this ideology of race drawn out by racism is actually causing them to suffer too. There's 21 million white people living in absolute poverty in the United States, and they're often the most. I mean, they're isolated and heavily indoctrinated, and massively segregated in the hills of Kentucky. No connections, no running water to the rest of the community. So the white ruling class will go in and really kind of indoctrinate, but then it goes along with their experience because they're so segregated. So I would say that we don't even have an ability to talk to one another about these issues. I feel that I have so much to learn from you to bring back, because I feel that you are very far ahead of us in this. I know that's probably depressing to you, but I think we could stand to learn a lot from your contexts.
Thank you very much. I've done my police work. I wonder who is who's going to give us the instruction.
Okay, so I'm going to, we're at 4 o'clock now, somewhere thereabouts. I'll say our CEO, Dr. Gomez, to bring us to give us a summary and conclusion for the day. And then we're going to invite Julian and Holly up front here, and they're going to begin conversation about their book. There's the launch of The Politics of Everybody, and Julian's book, Insurgent Citizens.
I think it's good that I'm not a politician. I was not going to make it. I tried to convince, that's why he's running away. I tried to convince him not to let me speak, but of course I didn't succeed. Now he wants me to speak. Yeah, but I think, ladies and gentlemen, there are a couple of points I would like to make in summary. The day has been very informative. There's the feedback we've been getting. Almost all the people I've spoken to during breaks are of the view that they've learned a lot from the discussions we've had, and that is also the impression I had. The speakers have done a sterling job, and these are the people who will consider inviting even in future. Because, it's very disappointing if we invite someone to come and grace the occasion, and then the person performs below par. Next time, we are not too sure what to do with that person. This time around, we have no problem. We know exactly what to do. So we would like to thank all the speakers who have spoken today, and we also thank the ones who are going to speak tomorrow in anticipation that we are going to keep the pace where it is, because they've raised the bar. Those who presented have raised the bar. The reasoning behind us putting this program together was to do a couple of things. One, we wanted that the minister should grace the occasion and set the tone, and then tell us what he thinks this particular colloquium is all about. And he did exactly that. He challenged the center to do certain things, which I noted down. I think my colleagues did the same. But he also outlined what he thought the colloquium will achieve, which I think all the presenters noted down. And then when our board chairperson does the overall summary tomorrow, I think we'll be able to reflect on those. But in today's session, another thing that we did when we put the program together, we wanted speakers to look at issues both from a micro level and from a macro level. If you look at the themes, they are structured in that manner. There are speakers who are looking at issues from a micro level, and there are those who are looking at issues from a broader perspective. And we also do a comparative analysis. Like if you listened to Professor Halley's paper, she's looking at racism from an American perspective. And yet we are dealing with the same issue in the South African context. So we wanted to do all those kinds of things, and we'll continue doing that tomorrow. So then I would like us to give all the speakers a round of applause for a job well done. Thank you. And having done that, I think I should also give this opportunity to us to give ourselves a round of applause for having made these speakers' life easy, not difficult. When we were inviting people to come, we had in mind that we wouldn't have a colloquium if we only have speakers, and that's it. You can't speak to yourself except some crazy politicians who don't want to listen. They just want to be talking all the time. So you need speakers, but you also need people they will speak to and then get feedback from. Because that is how we learn. And the more you talk, the lesser you listen. But the more you listen, the more you learn. So we move from that perspective. So thank you very much, colleagues. I hope that tomorrow we are going to continue from where we left off. Those who will be driving today, please drive safely. And then those who will be sleeping here, then it's fine. They are not going anywhere, so they are safe. We've guaranteed their safety. So thank you very much. Over to you.
Thanks. Just want to thank everyone for cooperating with us as well around timekeeping and orderly fashion. I'd like to invite Julian to come up to the front and join Holly. Both their books are on sale here. Holly has bought Cedric will be able to handle we'll be having, and we have two very different books, but two books that are in some ways the same. I thought you've heard that before. I would deciding who's going first. I think let's take Julian. We took the opportunity of being able to have both authors here, and then I took the opportunity of just saying, well, why don't you launch your book at the same time? I had initially written to Holly about an article she had published, and she said, "Oh, don't worry about the article, I've written a book on that." So when she decided to come out, talk was that there would be a launch of the book, and then we asked Julian. So I think we'll start with Julian, and to give us a breakdown of the book, and possibly more importantly, what caused you to sit down and take on the arduous job of writing a book. I know that in the economies of academic production, writing books is kind of what academics have to do regularly in order to gain points and get money and so on. But why did you sit down and write a book? Or this particular book?
Thank you very much. Hello again. I appreciate it's been a very long day, a long, dense, and engaged series of fascinating and wonderful intellectual work. In that context, I don't want to talk for very long. I think we've all had a lot of time in this room. But perhaps to answer one or two of the questions that Derek posed. This book is an attempt to come to grips with contemporary South African politics, to think about the politics of the present moment in this particular country. Sorry. My phone appears to have dialed itself in my pocket. Where was I? Contemporary South African politics. It is an attempt to come to grips with contemporary South African politics, starting from observation rather than from theory, and to use that observation as the basis to build and test a set of theories that might help us explain what we can see in the present moment. There's a sort of very trendy academic term, grounded theory. I'm not quite sure is what I'm doing, but it perhaps captures part of it. And if we look at South Africa today, as I suggested earlier, the most obvious site of political action, of political work, is protest. It is pervasive. It takes place everywhere. And it takes many different forms. I focused earlier, and in my book I do focus primarily on urban forms of protest, and struggle, on street struggle, on community organization, engagement, and sometimes the use of the courts, suing the state and other parties, sometimes the creation of alternative political movements. While some of these alternative political movements have not had huge amounts of electoral success, it is worth noting, for example, that in the Johannesburg metropole, there is a community-based movement, Operation Khanyisa, which is organized out of informal settlements and townships, and has, over the last 10 years, managed to put one person onto the Joburg Council in each election. One person isn't much, but it does speak to a form of politics that's not ordinarily recognized as part of protest. What I want to suggest is that when we start to look at South Africa as a country in which protest is the most common form of political action by the largest number of people, we start to see it differently. We start to see our transition from apartheid into the post-apartheid era differently, and we start to see different people as the key actors in politics. To put it crudely, what the president does matters, but so does what everybody else does. And we need to pay as much attention to ordinary South African citizens' acts of politics, acts of political agency, claims, and protests, as we do to any high-ranking official. Politics is not the sole preserve of those who govern us. We act as well. The book attempts to take this up, attempts to trace this through a series of different sites and different forms of political action, to contemplate and consider the ambiguities that come from attempts to build movements, attempts to organize, attempts to find funding for movements, attempts to sustain them. There is no purity in politics either. Overall, why have I written it? Well, I've written it because this is the world I live in, and almost all of us live in. And the only task that I think justifies the writing of a book and the expectation of all of you, of course, to go out and read the book, is to try to say something about the world in which we live, to try to raise ideas, raise questions, and spur others, not me as a writer, but you as readers, to come up with your own answers to the questions I pose, and your own questions out of what I have written. I may very well be wrong. I almost certainly hope that I am, because if I am wrong, then you can take up the thought and do more with it than I have been able to. Thank you.
I'm going to actually take a copy of my book. That one, there we go. Okay. So I'm going to answer the first question. Why did I take this up? Writing this particular book, particularly, my editor laughed at me. You know, she said, "You're writing a book called The Politics of Everybody." She said, "You're mad," and started laughing at me. You know, but the book isn't about trying to include every single person on the planet and make sure that they're here. You know, like you forgot my Aunt Lucy is not in this book. It's not going to be like that. The question that I was dealing with was a question of how do we live in a globalized capitalist system, in a global neoliberalism. So the question becomes, for me, how do we understand a global politics that isn't kind of a Western universalizing, erasing politics? So I'm using Field's idea of how we get to know things, this idea that I touched on in my talk about ideology as a product of lived experience, but also something that's embedded in a system. And I try to take that to understand how we can approach the global question. But there's another part to this, and that's that I'm interested in that when we talk about the international question, we often talk about the national question, but what we don't often talk about is the question of gender and sexuality nationally, and internationally or globally. And that is where one very strong line of my research is, and I was asked to answer this question because nobody was asking it from an LGBTI perspective. Nobody was conquering the LGBTI/Marx question, particularly in the United States, where people don't know anything, know very, very little about Marxism. So I was motivated because there is this bizarre idea of why things are the way they are in the United States. And it's questions of economy are always turned into issues of normality and uniformity. So there's this idea that once one becomes normative or normal, one is helping capitalism, and thereby if one breaks norms, one is breaking capitalism. I can imagine this must sound probably very strange here, but if I go into the left in the United States, there's this idea that, for example, if you are a woman and you're not challenging gender norms in some kind of way, then you are, you're a part of the system. You are going along and you're upholding it. If you are an LGBT person and you're arguing for rights for yourself, you are taking part of the system. You're normalizing yourself. So there's a very counterculturalist bent to U.S. politics where you have to remove yourself. And this is at odds with Marxism, because you can't be, being a counterculturalist Marxist is a very, so you're supposed to make yourself smaller and distant and not connected to the rest of the proletarian movement. It doesn't make any sense, right? But I was really kind of quite irritated because so even some Marxist comrades were taking up this rhetoric around this idea of normativity. So in LGBTI political context, they would be saying, we need to fight against same-sex marriage. And then there would be heterosexual comrades in the rooms that would, what were they supposed to do? Say, okay, you shouldn't have that right? It became a very awkward conversation. So I tried to put this into real experiential terms. I'm going to give an outline of the chapters of the book that'll maybe help you understand the structure of it. So there are 3 chapters, and one is debates in Western gender politics. I recognize that my situation is Western, so I'm talking about Western gender politics. And like Julia said, I am hoping that other people take up speaking from their perspectives. I am not going to do that Western universalizing thing of speaking for other people. So it starts with debates in Western gender politics. What I'm trying to do is get the feminist community talking to the queer community, it's called the LGBTI community, and having the LGBTI community speak to the Marxist community and vice versa. I have so there's a lot of primers in here so that the groups can have a common language to speak on. I have a chapter on what is capitalism, the Marxian roots of queer political thought, and I have a section on Marxism and gender that goes through the entire history of Marx and gender through some new scholars' work. And then I touch on this idea of queer nationalism, which was a concept that came out of the HIV/AIDS movement in the 1990s, because the working class was so virulently anti-gay that, and people were dying so rapidly that sexuality and this position as a person with HIV/AIDS took precedent over the class relations at that moment. There was an immediacy of need, and this created this idea that there's something called queer nationalism, bridging on other kinds of nationalisms. And I talk about the problem that that caused in the Western gender context. But my hope is for the beginning of talking about something called we've been calling it a queer Marxism or an LGBTI Marxism, but it's a Marxism that uses political economy to not only address issues of race and gender and nation, but also of sexuality and the composition of what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman, but something that can be taken up and used by anybody anywhere. And completely changed, right? Completely changed. So that's why I gave the summary of what the chapters are, because explaining all that would be way too much. So that's all.